Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people from all over the world, and we're so excited to have you here today. And so we are here today. I am Alex Arnold. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Taos Institute. Many of you already know us. We are a virtual educational organization. We are a nonprofit and we promote social constructionist theory and practices. We do this through many different ways. We have workshops, conferences, dialogue with the authors like the one today. We have an online community that is free and open and very easy to join, the Taos Institute Commons. We hope that you're already members or have visited us, and if not, we invite you to do so. And I will not take much time today because we're here with Ken Gergen for a dialogue with the author on his book, An Invitation to Social Construction, Co-Creating the Future. Ken is the co-founder and president of the Taos Institute. I will put the link to his bio in the chat if you want to read more about his many contributions and accomplishments. So we're very honored to have you here today, Ken. And we also have Celiani Camargo Borges, board member of the Taos Institute, and Celiani will help facilitate and filter your questions. So we're all welcoming you here today. So Ken, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks so much. I am a little bit embarrassed with the people coming into this room because I shouldn't be taking up all the time. So many people are doing such important work. You should all be talking here instead of me. Or I've been awed by the work many of you do. And in fact, some of that indeed appears in the book. Now, the book we're supposed to discuss. I thought making this kind of a zippy talk about what's happened with the book, but on second thought, why not make this a little bit more demanding? Share some ideas that have gone on with that book, so that you can come away with something, some things to think about, to share. I'm fortunate to have Celiani here with us today too. Celiani, we will also be watching. Also, if you have any comments or questions you'd like to make along the way, I'll put them in the chat, and what she will do is attempt to distill those later on to open the discussion. Because I'll probably talk for possibly a half hour or so. And I hope some of this will be interesting, not just a book review. I plan to divide this into sort of three parts. One, my general orientation of the book, which has changed quite significantly. Secondly, about some aspects of the content, particularly the sort of new developments that are interesting to me. And finally, what you might call illuminations, things that have occurred to me along the way in the writing that have brought me up short, given me sort of special insight or doubts. And I'll save that to the end. Now, orientation. This is usually if you're rewriting a book, and this is the 4th edition, it's not so difficult because you can simply add some pieces to discussions that are already there. I couldn't do that this time. It's as if the whole drama of the world had changed in the last 10 years. The drama of social construction and that book, 25 years ago, the 1st edition, was essentially a drama of ideas. It was the shift from sort of a science-based view of reality, which was beginning to sort of control everything that could be said that was true, and beginning to sort of organize our lives around a scientific orientation with rationality and evidence at its center. It was a shift to opening a space to view ourselves as constructing the worlds in many, many different ways. It was like a liberation from multiple perspectives, each with their own orientations, their ways of looking at things, which could add richness to our future together. Now, that was it was an intellectual drama, and it wasn't simply with social construction. It was going on in many, many places, but the book tried to zero in on that and make it clear and apparent. And that intellectual drama then became a drama with sort of the revolution in practices, moving into spaces of multiple perspectives, into collaboration and so on, in a variety of areas. That was the original drama. At this point, however, I felt with, and I probably share this with all of you, a sense that the world was moving towards a sort of a catastrophic condition. We were pummeling along the route to self-destruction in a sense. This is the middle of the pandemic, the environmental devastation, the toppling of governments, and so on, without any control. Could not do right as an intellectual drama. That was no longer possible. So it was difficult to reworking these materials so they could make a difference. I won't do a lot of reading today, but I just want to read one passage at the beginning of the book, because this will also give you a sense of how the reading goes. My attempt to be sort of transparent with this too. This is a section called Words and Worlds, and I'm going to read for about 4 minutes. So let me begin by sharing with you a little known secret, that I can fly. Truly, while it may seem unbelievable, I can actually fly. Now, perhaps you're smiling, knowing I must be joking. No, I'm quite sincere in this matter, nor would most people say that I'm either mentally ill or a liar. Okay, you reply, let me see you fly. At this point, I rise from my chair and leap 6 inches into the air. You say, that's not flying, you announce, that's just a jump. But in fact, that is what I myself call flying. Which of us then is reporting accurately on whether I can fly? Of course, most English speakers would agree with you that my action is a jump, not flying. But what if I had a close group of friends who would agree with me? Yeah, Gergen can fly, he just showed you. At this point, the truth of my ability to fly is just a matter of numbers. And if a matter of numbers, then how many people do I need on my side before I can declare the truth of my flying abilities? What if I built a following on social media, put on an ad campaign? What if you became a weird and laughable minority, not acknowledging my abilities? Does the truth of the matter rest solely on social agreement? This isn't a trivial issue. Isn't the aim of science to reveal the truth about the world? Don't jury trials seek to determine guilt or innocence on the basis of facts? Don't we want newspapers to tell us about what is really going on? Don't we institutionalize people because they are out of touch with reality? In truth, in all these cases, just a question of social agreement. These can be issues of life and death. Of course, you might say I'm overstating the case. In case of flying, this is simply a difference in the way we use words. And now consider the following statements about what is the case. Human beings have free will, or there are 2 genders, male and female, or the fertilized egg carried by a pregnant woman is a human being, or the world's population is composed of 6 basic races, or humans descended from fish, or the earth is supported by 4 elephants standing on the back of a turtle. These are all statements about which many agree, but many do not. Nor can we easily settle the case by saying, well, we're just using different words. In some of these cases, it is a matter of life and death as to the particular choice of words. In the case of free will, one may be imprisoned for life, depending on whether their actions are called, freely chosen or intentional, as opposed to, let's say, determined by brain condition. For many people, the question of whether the fertilized egg is a human being is literally a matter of life or death. Those who agree will also see abortion as a form of murder. Here, the choice of words has become a choice between good and evil. To press further, it's impossible in some of these cases to say that people are indeed using different words to describe the same thing. Unlike the example of my flying, we can't observe an intention or a point at which an embryo becomes a human being or the 4 elephants and the turtle. Nor can we observe people's motivation or justice or hope, inspiration, God, and thousands of other terms that inform so many of us about what exists. Still further, there are many who suffer abuse by simply using the word as if it did refer to the world, simply posing the question about the number of races or whether one is male or female is oppressive to many people. The peoples of the world now come together as never before. Technologies of digital communication allow instantaneous, nonstop communication. Mass transportation, air travel, and human migration are at an all-time high. In the words of Cameroon philosopher Achille Mbembe, we live in an age of planetary entanglement. It is also a confrontation in our worlds of meaning. There are currently more than 6,000 active languages in the world, ways of describing, explaining, and caring. And even within a language community, there can be enormous differences. Regardless of the political system, religion, ethnic tradition, community, family, or couple, the potential for disruptive disagreement is ever at hand. Within the Christian church alone, there are some 45,000 denominations, each of which differs from all the others in its claims to what is the case and the values placed on these claims. Should we hope that for an ultimate untangling of these differences, a time when full and empathic understanding will emerge? Even here, there would be resistance. For many, such a universal accord would be found both stifling and dangerously paralyzing. Nor is it a question of untangling the current disagreements, as new enclaves of agreement are ever forming and thus new challenges to current agreements. Internet communication allows any small movement, no matter how marginal the fantasy, the taste, or the goal, to locate the like-minded. If we live in an ever-emerging pluriverse of differences, how are we to survive? That's kind of a prologue to the book, and you can see where I'm a little bit of the weight that's attached to what I'm hoping will be the unfolding contents of the book. Let me turn a bit to the content. First of all, realize that the sort of grounds for a social constructionist view, which came out of largely 70s and 80s of the last century, those challenges to positivism and the establishment of a constructionist perspective, they pretty much have remained the same. There isn't a giant evolution. It was like a paradigm shift. And you can't have a paradigm shift every moment you turn around. That still remains largely the same. What really changes are the applications, the ways in which people have drawn from that. So most of the content changes in those chapters are adding weight to, let's say, the way in which it plays out in education, ways in which it plays out in social research and organizations and therapy and healthcare and so on. I've also tried wherever possible to kind of bring in more cases from outside the Anglo-European perspective, because there's enormous work going on around the world. I'm just awe-inspiring. I've tried. I haven't been totally successful. There's some limits because the references are in other languages and it's hard to, or at least in our purview, to access that material. But that's been the attempt and it's never good enough. But let me say a little bit about the particular additions here, and which may be of interest. The chapter on organizations, I've added a rather large section on government as an organization, because for one, I am unsettled by the capacity of government, of formal government, to bring us together in any satisfactory way. Governments across the world are either riven by conflict within or tend to be totalitarian. They're cut away from people in many respects. In the meantime, social media, the internet allows enormous amounts of changes to go on, and the government can't control it or keep up with it. So the force of government in terms of organizing our lives seems to me receding. On the other side of that, and this is what draws me to it from a constructionist perspective, begun to see a huge movement of nonprofits or independent organizations trying to do something with governance, that is, with the people trying to band together and sort things out to make a difference that would bring our communities together for some common good. There must be 15 different titles for this. Sometimes it's called relational governance, sometimes co-governance, deliberative democracy, and so on. They all have qualities that really are quite congenial with a constructionist perspective. They're all about collaboration, multiple voices, bringing them together and bringing us together as people. Many of them ally themselves with government. So, for example, government now, in this case, works with people on local conditions, giving the people the ways of applying the sort of policies in ways that can make a positive difference within communities. Anyway, I just thought I'd want to call attention to that because I think in the future, this movement towards governance, in which we become much more significant in generating our futures together, becomes important. So, collaborative governance. A second movement, I've made a lot of it, I've written about it, but I see it now becoming increasingly important. For me, it was called future forming inquiry. Let me take a step back. You can see the significance of this. Social sciences have inherited a natural science view, generally, of doing research on what is the case. Natural sciences could do that because what is the case remain rather stable. Plants would go in the same way 1 century as largely in the next century. Natural world didn't change that rapidly, or at least the parts that were studied. So we inherited that. So we do research on something, on a topic now. But if the world is undergoing rapid change, with discussion, with coordinations and so on, and new initiatives developing all the time, what is the point of doing research on what exists? As if somehow we could make generalizations and predictions for the future, as the natural sciences would. What is the point of sort of gazing at the passing parade and reporting on it as if that report at time 1 has anything much to do with time 3? In the meantime, time 3 is threatening us. So, this is not a total argument. I'm not saying let's give it all up. But I'm saying, what if we change the direction of research Not the reporting on what is, but creating the future. Action research would be an obvious case in point, but there are many others. Selian's book on design research and construction, for example, is of this sort. You use design research to create something. What if we shifted the whole template of research to remaking or making anew? So I try to build that into the research area as a kind of a means of going towards the future. I've also tried, where possible, to make the material relevant to contemporary topics. I mean, how could you write a book on social construction in modern times without talking about fake news or lying while in public office? Now, these may seem cut and dried issues, but they're not. Because with respect to the news, I mean, where we've tried to have a sense of objective news, that there were real facts to be reported and you could do it neutrally, we've become progressively aware within constructionist ideas, there isn't any unbiased news. It's always from some perspective. It always highlights certain things and leaves out others. There isn't any news that isn't politically implicated. It is all advocacy at some level. So we have to settle for the fact that if you go on Fox News, it's not all lies. It may be a perspective, and it may be so heavily biased that we think this is crazy. But it is a perspective, by and large, in the same way that, let's say, MSNBC would be here in the United States. So then you have to make some other kinds of inquiries. And here we turn to factuality. Now, again, there's a nuanced issue here. What is a lie in a world with multiple perspectives? If we're constructing worlds, as I've gone into, what would a lie be? The conclusion you have to reach here is that we develop within communities standards of what is true. And that is, these are agreements about how we talk about things like whether I can fly or not. So most of us would agree it's fact that I cannot fly. Within our world, that is a fact. And we can tell, you might say I have told a lie about it, seemingly, but I've tried to tell you, hey, in another world, that may be true. So if there is public agreement, for example, on the numbers of people who attend something, or the number of bombs dropped, or the number of people killed, if we as a community agree about those kinds of things, then you can tell a lie. And lying in that case has enormous negative consequences for our abilities to live together. A good sort of, the analogy would be, you can easily tell a lie in natural science because there are agreements within communities about what counts. Fairly strong standards about what counts as the real, and so on. And within a public community, if let's say a country or an international, there are some agreements. And if you disrupt those agreements and tell a lie within that, you disrupt the community in the sense that you generate broad sense of mistrust. And that indeed is what I see happening today. That lies in that sense are becoming commonplace, and distrust becomes our way of life now. All right. I also added some material on ideas, concepts. I make a lot in the book, as I have last time, on relational theory, because I think For me, that's been a major change, at least in my own thinking and many others. The shift in relational theory is trying to move from looking at relations as composed of individual elements into looking at the relationship as creating the elements. The whole perspective changes from looking at individuals like here on the screen to taking account of that which we are saying to each other as creating us. Okay. I will be giving a couple of seminars on relational theory later on for Taos Institute, and I think it's November. If people want to attend those, great, it'd be terrific. There's also the book Relational Being. Okay, what I've added there is an account of human understanding, whether it be in everyday life or therapy or on governments and organizations and so on. How do we understand each other? Traditionally, at least we've generally understanding as intersubjective. That is, you use words as an expression of something of meaning inside the head, an intention, a thought, a feeling existing somewhere behind the words. So when I talk from that perspective, I am sharing, let's say, a thought. Now, I won't go into it. There's a long discussion here about why that doesn't work as a theory. That is, if you really took that seriously, we'd never communicate at all. But if you'd have a hard time ever getting the first conversation started because you would never be able to know what it was behind the words. It'd just be nonsense words. So there, the attempt is to reconceptualize understanding, not as a way of attempting to look inside people's minds, but almost like a form of dance, of making moves within the conversation that are coordinated with the moves that have been made before, where each move in the conversation creates what has taken place as something. That is, if I ask a question or seem to ask a question, it doesn't become a question until you, let's say, give me an answer. The answer creates me as having asked a question. Because you could say, I find that insulting. I haven't asked a question, I've been insulting. So by answering, you've given me, you've defined me as someone who's asked a question. Nor can you answer a question without having been asked. So the two, it's the coordination out of which meaning is made. So I attempt to go on to that and say something about what that would mean in terms of therapy and other venues, looking at understanding more like a dance. Okay, I also did something on relational ethics, but I want to come back to that in just a few minutes. Illuminations and worries, this third part. Maybe this happens whenever you're writing, and maybe it happens when you're writing theses or any book. As I came to do this, increasingly, I just became struck with how absolutely significant this body of ideas that we're playing with here is to the future. It is that may have seemed like a little plaything at the beginning about whether I can fly, but this whole movement towards looking at human communication as that which holds us together, that coordination is all we have. Like without that kind of connection, what is there? nothing to, I mean, we've watched the government that was almost destroyed within 4 years. How can you destroy a government? It's been there for a couple of hundred years. Suddenly, boom, doesn't take much. Just some distrust, disagreements, and so on. So this emphasis in constructionism and relational theory on being curious about each other, of being open to the possibilities, of co-creating with the other, of coordinating with the other. The more I wrote, the more I just began to see that our future really depends on these kinds of capacities and these sorts of practices that many of you are engaged in. Now, that was kind of like, wow, yes, this has to be pressed. One piece of the past that dropped out for me, however, ever since the first edition, there's been a pretty strong emphasis at the very beginning within this background of constructionism, often called critical theory. Without going into it, that whole tradition of critical theory, which attempted to look at the ideological and political implications of any statement about what is true. Right? It was tremendously important as a liberating device. Well, the field of mental health is an obvious example. When the whole constructionism is a companion to the whole LGBT movement, getting it out of the diagnostic categories and into a way of life, a way of being. Because you could criticize the diagnostic categories for being oppressive, for being authoritarian, or being groundless. That is, they weren't wrong, they were just categories of a single community imposed on people. So the whole critique of the DSM, for example, which continues into today, is based on a kind of critical theory idea that when you begin to declare truth about the nature of, you are also engaging in potentially in political, socio-political change. Now, again, that's a highly liberating perspective of Michel Foucault, most of you have read, would be a prime example. What I see happening, however, is that movement, which originally was liberating, has now become divisive. Because it's not simply that one begins to note the socio-political consequences. That moment of critique has become loaded with kind of moral significance. There's a moral high ground, as if those who have the categories are somehow evil. It has been the same here in the United States. It's been hugely divisive in terms of critical race theory, which came out of the same background. To be sure, there's been an oppression of the history of slavery in this country, as in most countries where slavery has existed. But when it becomes a moral endeavor, so that the other becomes an evil, that is, it others a group of people, then it becomes divisive. It doesn't become a matter of understanding of how can we understand and explore this together. It becomes a matter of critique of the other, of course, but then with backlash, and then with the polarization of society. So somehow that the whole critical movement, if it's to persist, it needs to develop some other form of communication than this sort of sense of blame of the other for being oppressive or biased or whatever. Finally, I mentioned relational ethics. It's been kind of an important illumination for me. Constructionist theory was wide open to possibilities, every voice, every possibility. It didn't designate a way to go. Some people indeed found that repugnant. That is, it didn't make a declaration of the good of any kind. In fact, in the book, I talk about a luncheon I had with a philosopher who walked away from the table when she realized that I couldn't, within constructionism, make a case against the Holocaust. I couldn't make a foundational claim. And if the theory didn't make the foundational claim to anything, then it was amoral. It also, even though people have used constructionist theory, again, it has been interesting that there is sort of a lot of agreement about the good, but it's unstated, that most of us would rather generate collaborative practices than help each person to be independent. It's just kind of in the blood, even though there's no statement of the good. So when I was trying to develop relational theory, I eventually moved into an ethical stance, because even though relational theory is a construction, if you move inside of it, you begin to see that without the capacity of coordination, without that movement, a positive capacity to coordinate, we deteriorate. We have nothing to say, we have nothing to do. We are simply disintegrating as we become all against all. So that value becomes placed on that process of coordination, on that process of moving together. That is, the ethic becomes that of care for the relation, care for the relational process. No, it's quite different from the whole Judeo-Christian ethic of care for the other. I care for you. It is give attention to the relational process out of which we all become. What kinds of relational process would help us into the future? Would mean the possibility of living together for another century, which may be in doubt. So there's an ethical cry there. And for me, I guess, and I don't know for others, but I find that even though it's a non-foundational ethic, it adds a kind of zest to what I do. It gives me a sense of urgency of, yes, this is a way to go. And I've said something about that in the book. It's non-foundational, but I found it highly compelling, moving towards the enriching qualities of relatedness as opposed to individual well-being. Okay, that's a mouthful. Thank you for being patient. And Celiani, I hope you've been, perhaps there's some chats, I haven't looked.
Thank you, Ken. How lucky are we to have you updating this book, this so successful book from 25 years ago, and getting these current complex issues updated. So nice to hear from you. So before I start with the questions, I didn't get many questions. So if you still have questions for Ken, please write in the chat so I can read them out loud, maybe combining, make some clusters here. So it's coming. So before I ask the first question, I just want to invite all of you, if you would like to dive deep into these ideas and the book, in the upcoming fall, Taos is offering a 6 weeks course on Introduction to Social Construction. So then you're going to have the opportunity to dive deep, but also to see how it can be applied to your own practice. Ken, the first question I got from Mark, and he was wondering, when you talk about this future-focused inquiry, is this the same concept that you bring for the challenge on generative research methods that you have written before?
Not the emphasis changes. When I was really into generative theory, generative research practices, I was looking for practices that would open up new spaces, that would cut against the sort of dominant assumptions, and which would give us room for new thoughts, for new developments, and so on. So it was a way of trying not to do research just as deductive from suppositions, but research which was actively creating some opening in those assumptions, challenging them. So here the emphasis really changes, not from just challenging what exists, but to actually stepping into the future with what one does. You could, for many of you who got practices, you can look at those practices as indeed future forming practices. That is, they become in some form action research. They are attempts to move forward, not because you know they're right, but because you feel that they are moving in good directions. And hopefully you get sort of feedback so that they indeed become better over time. So that practices become part of future forming inquiry for me, in the same way that action research would do it for, like participatory action research would do it for, let's say, people in universities.
Just to go along with the same topic, one participant is asking also, how do you view the idea of bias?
Bias. Well, it's a poor concept in one sense, because bias presumes there's a standard by which there would be a truth, some standard of truth which we can compare bias against. So I use it because everybody else sort of understands, but I don't like the concept very much. Let's say one can look at things within perspectives, within traditions. Now, in that sense, yeah, natural science is a bias, but it doesn't help to look at it that way. It is a tradition, a way of understanding things, and which allows us to do certain things and not others. So it helps me very much to take a second, give that a second thought. I'm going to get that out of my vocabulary to the extent that I can.
Okay, I have some questions. I'm going to connect some of them that they are related to moral, ethics, and lie. So some of the participants are asking if you can talk more about the meaning of a lie in a world of perspectives. So if a big mass agree on something, is the different perspective necessarily a lie? Or why not a disagreement? And also some of the participants are saying they're having a hard time distinguishing between moral and ethics based on your description. And here there is one example with a critical race theory, for example. You discussed how putting moral beliefs or assumptions can be divisive and therefore problematic. How does ethics come into play?
Yeah, I want to go on a huge disquisition on the relationship of ethics to morals, but just roughly speaking, we generally look at ethics as a larger system of interrelated propositions where morals become a sort of a local agreements about what is the good. They run into each other all the time because local morals can also be the result of ethical principles that in fact are that they know nothing about. I mean, many of our morals, for example, in the United States come out of a Christian ethic, even though most people wouldn't recognize Christianity as being their source. So I guess I I wanted to get that question a little sharper before going into it, because this is going to take me off into sort of an abstruse area about why that's different. Let me off the hook there, lest I become so abstract as to be nonsensical. Go back to, rewind that a little bit, Celiani. What else is there outside of that particular?
How do you see mental health crisis?
You really have to sort through. I mean, it's a really good question, because everybody's talking about mental health crisis. Huge numbers of facts about all, the problems of youth, the anxieties, and so on. It's everywhere. But if mental illness is a construction, you have to be really careful about how we talk about these things, because if we use a word like anxiety, suddenly now you're into the mental health arena, where the logics are not necessarily helpful. That is, you will quickly find yourself on an anti-anxiety drug, when indeed anxiety is a way of talking about things that happen to be owned by a particular profession. Do we need it? So the soaring in anxiety, depression, ADHD, and so on, you have to look at with some skepticism as a real problem in mental health. I would rather not, because whatever is happening does not demand that particular characterization. What if we begin to understand it in other ways? As most of us, I think, are uneasy about what's going on in the world today. Whether, if we call that unease, anxiety, we can do it, but does it help? And particularly, does it help our children when 1 in 10 children in the United States will be on antidepressants or anti-anxiety pills by the time they're 12? So yeah, something's happening. We're sort of aware of it, but let's be very careful and creative about what we call it, looking for other possibilities than talking about mental health.
Okay, so there are many questions coming up. I'm making a note of all of them, so if you're not able to address them now, we can always continue the conversation. But there is also another question from a different topic, but again, how can social construction address now the climate crisis? So we were talking about mental health. How about climate crisis?
Yeah. Again, I look for the practices here. First of all, we have to agree that there is a climate crisis. I mean, now that's a construction. I think the vast majority of the world would be willing to call it a climate crisis, and I'm open to that. In the same way, I'm open to the medical profession telling me I have cancer or not. As I'm open to certain realities, I'm willing to live by them for now, even though I can question them. Climate crisis is one of those. At that point, you begin to say, well, what can we do? And indeed, it's not trivial, because forms of action research, and there's a whole branch of action research which is largely involved with those kinds of issues, those global issues. How can we in participatory groups intervene with or create future of global issues? So again, they're collaborative. They bring in multiple voices. They try to move into the future changes in the world. They are relationally ethical, in my view. So that would be one example.
We have some questions around governance and government. I'm trying to connect them here, but I'm starting with one participant is saying, if governments are becoming more totalitarian, they can stop the governance processes of attempted collaboration between people. So people trying to organize collaboration as a way of life and a way of living gets thwarted, for example, by the economic and political interests of those in the government. So the question, how then can we nurture governance in these situations? And also you talked about mistrust as a result of lying governments. What is the basis of this mistrust, as it could be only another perspective, just like you flying?
We got two issues there. One on totalitarianism. In one sense, totalitarianism has a very difficult challenge, because the conversations within a country continue to go. You may try to control them, and you can control the press, you can control some of the media, but you cannot control that continuing conversation. And particularly now, with all the means we have of talking with each other, all the internet potentials. So anytime you can't, if you can't control the conversation, you can't control the politics, because people will develop their own sense of what's right and good and so on. They will foster revolutions of many kinds. So if you maintain a totalitarian government, it would have to have some way of being linked into the common conversation so they actually reflect those conversations. Well, that wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, given what's happening now, it would be a better idea. This maybe sound crazy to you. It would be a better idea than what we have now as democratic policy making in the United States, which is totally contentious based. It is a fight. It's not about the policies, it's a fight between political parties for ascendance. So the common good becomes thrown to the wind. It's a dysfunctional form of government as it is now, and worse because of its disconnection with the public. So anyway, you could have a totalitarian, which would be like a benign dictatorship that in fact was responsive to it, but that unfortunately is not the way it tends to work. If the people lost trust with a totalitarian government, if they lost trust because it was being lied to, there will be enormous consequences within those common conversations. And I think Russia, what's happening in Russia today is just a good example. There is so much dissension going on within the people. It is difficult to see the outcome, but it's not going to be a happy outcome. So one, if they were in a totalitarian position, lying is very dangerous if that means going against the consensus of what is real of the population. That last little bit, by the way, is loaded, because if we lose any form of consensus in a country, if consensus is, if there's nothing we share in the way of what is true or real, then the country collapses, basically. And that's a reason for some very deep, significant thought. How do we build something in a way of common consensus about what is the case and what is the good.
Yeah, and that connects to my next question. One participant is also touching this idea, which is one of the highest critique against social construction, which is anything goes. So without an ethics based on how we could go on together, how can we, avoid this chaos? And maybe if you expand a little bit on relational ethics, this could be a way out then. Could it?
That's precisely my own feeling too. It becomes a way out, but again, without putting a stake in the ground and saying, if you don't agree with this, the highway. So it's a relational ethic which requires a relation to become ethical within its case. Anyway.
Yeah. So another participant saying that relational ways require transcending egoistic modes of self-construal and creating shareable spaces. Today's world shows resistance to it, leading to conflict. What are some of the possible strategies to deal with such resistances?
So the resistances are to relating. Is that the question?
Yeah, relational ways requiring transcending these egoistic modes. Yeah, but there's a lot of resistance to that, and this will lead into conflict.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and let me just say one small thing here because I have only a minute left. My own thinking in the last few years has begun to look for what we call scaffolds of coordination. That is, conditions which invite us to collaborate, to co-create. Conditions of competition between nations, for example, between states, between political parties. Those are conditions. That's a scaffold, a form of relationship, which is killing the potential of those relationships. When we are competitive, collaboration, coordination becomes extremely difficult. If we do not remove those scaffolds from education all the way up into international government, then I think the prognosis is not a good one. So an invitation then, think in terms of scaffolds. What kinds of traditions, what kinds of conditions need to be changed? That's the essence, by the way, of this book I did on the tyranny of testing. Get rid of tests in schools, and you increase the potential for collaboration. So long as they're just testing, there is going to be contention and conflict.
Thank you, Ken. We have many more questions. I'm afraid our time is up.
You have what I can do. Come in November.
Yes, so once again, thank you so much, Ken, for this time today together for this conversation. And I put the link in the chat. So for two of our offerings, we have a 6-week course with Ciliani, Introduction to Social Construction, and then 2 separate workshops. You can take one or the other or both. That will be with Ken in November, and you can find them in the link in the chat. So this has been recorded today. The recording will be available on our website, as with all of our other Dialogue with the Authors recordings. If you registered to join us today, then you will be notified via email when the recording is available. And please join our online community, the Taos Institute Commons, where we can continue to exchange resources, sharing the recording of this meeting, continue the conversation. So we welcome you all to join us there. So thank you so much, Ciliani, for facilitating the questions. And Ken, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.